I don't know what the best course in the world is, but if you were to narrow it down to 2 or 3 candidates, Cypress Point would be one of them. Let's dive deep. I'm Garrett Morrison, and this is Designing Golf. All right, this is a big one. We're talking about Cypress Point Club in Pebble Beach, California, the venue of the upcoming 2025 Walker Cup. This golf course was designed by Alister MacKenzie with some key contributions from his associate Robert Hunter. There was also input from members of the development team, which included Samuel Morse and Marian Hollands. Construction began in late 1927, and the first round was played in August 1928. Since the day it opened, Cypress Point has been one of the small handful of the world's most remarkable golf courses. The property's mixture of duneland, forest, and seaside cliffs is unique and extraordinarily beautiful, and the routing of the course alternates between those environments seamlessly. Every golfer knows about the ocean holes, the miniature 15th, the huge 16th, and the strategic par 4 17th. But what makes Cypress Point is that the holes in the dunes and the trees are just as good as the ones on the seaside coast. And if you ask a member what their favorite hole is, they're just as likely to name an inland hole like the 9th or the 13th as a seaside one. Alister MacKenzie himself was thrilled with the course. He wrote, "Not only is it the best golfing terrain I have ever had to deal with, but it is the only course I have ever been associated with which has given me complete satisfaction in regard to the details of the construction work." MacKenzie went on to compare Cypress Point to his ideal golf course, the old course at St. Andrews. He wrote, "Cypress Point has similar strategic problems to St. Andrews and is infinitely more spectacular and beautiful. For years, I have been contending that in our generation, no other golf course could possibly compete with the strategic problems, the thrills, excitement, variety, and lasting and increasing interest of the old course, but the completion of Cypress Point has made me change my mind." So today we're doing a deep dive into the golf course at Cypress Point. We'll be joined for part of the episode by the author of the club's upcoming centennial book, David Normoyle. David and I will talk about the history of Cypress Point's founding and construction. Later, we'll bring on Joshua Pettit, a golf architect and the founder of the Alister MacKenzie Institute. Josh and I will discuss a few fun stories about specific aspects of Cypress Point's architecture. And for the other parts of the episode, I'll just be talking with you directly, with my producer, Will Balsam, kind of as a sounding board with me. I'll just be monologuing essentially about the course's land, routing, strategic design, greens, and restoration work, and so on. Now, before we get to all of that, I want to talk for a minute about some of my personal history with Cypress Point. If you'll indulge me just for a couple of minutes here. I've been fascinated with this course since I was a kid. I've told this story before, but my interest in golf course design really started when my dad brought home a copy of the World Atlas of Golf. And the map, this book has these great, beautiful maps in it. The map that I looked at the most was the map of Cypress Point. It was just the most outrageously cool looking course I could imagine. I could barely believe that it was real, but it was also in a setting that I was very familiar with. I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, which is about a 4-hour drive from Monterey. And I obviously started to wonder, will I ever get to play this golf course? Is that even possible? Fast forward about 20 years later, and I moved to Pebble Beach to teach at a boarding school called Stevenson School. Stevenson is right next to Spyglass Hill Golf Course, which in turn is right next to Cypress Point. So it was about a 15-minute walk to the forest holes at Cypress Point from where I lived on campus, in a house on campus. It was faculty housing at Stevenson School. And I lived and worked there for 5 years. And I walked by Cypress Point many times. Funny thing about Cypress is that it's not really hidden from public view. The first, 13th, and 14th holes are right next to 17 Mile Drive. You can even pull to the side of the road and hang out on Fanshell Beach, and you're literally 100 yards from the 13th green. And if you wanted to take it a step further, there's a public hiking trail that runs along the top of the dune ridge above the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th holes. It's called the Green Trail. You can park in the Pebble Beach Equestrian Center, and within a few minutes, you're looking at Cypress Point. So it's not one of those courses that's concealed behind gates and completely inaccessible. But of course, it is not easy to get a tee time at Cypress. It's a small membership club that likes to keep things very low-key and low profile. So during the 5 years that I lived in Pebble Beach, within literally 800 yards, as the crow flies, of the 5th green at Cypress Point, I actually never played it. And this was around the time that I was getting back into golf, getting interested in golf course design again, starting to write about it. And that eventually led to the career that I have now. But at the time, I often thought to myself how funny it was that I had this passion for golf courses, these things that I could look at and maybe get close to, but not actually experience in a few key cases. It's sort of like if you were a movie lover and there was a film that you knew to be one of the greatest ever made. Everybody thought that it was the greatest, but you couldn't watch it. You could just sort of hang out outside the theater and maybe catch a few lines of dialogue or a few hits of the score. That's what it felt like for me with Cypress Point. And I didn't feel that with any bitterness. I wasn't angry about it. It just amused me a little bit. How have I put myself in this position that this is what I really love, and it has kind of this weird dynamic. And I think the reason that I wasn't bitter about it or angry about it is partly because I figured I probably would eventually get a chance to play the course. And that did turn out to be the case. I've been very lucky to play Cypress Point a few times now. But the reason I'm telling you about all this is that I know that some of you listening are probably in the same position that I was a number of years ago when I loved this golf course that I didn't have any way of playing. I know what that's like, and I don't take it for granted at all that I've now gotten to study this course in person, and I'm thrilled that I'm in a position to relay what I've learned to you. I'm very grateful for all of that. And I just add that if you have a real and enduring passion for golf architecture, if you become involved in the community of fellow enthusiasts, you will end up getting opportunities that you never thought you'd get. And that's what's happened for me. And I think that that's a true thing about this community that we're part of. So that's it for the personal section of the podcast. We'll now properly get into the deep dive on Cypress Point, and we'll start with some history. My guest for that segment is David Normoyle. But first, I want to talk about our sponsor for this episode, Best Day Brewing. Best Day has a really cool origin story. It was created by Tate Hufford and launched a little over 3 years ago. Basically, Tate led a very active and social lifestyle, and he loves a good beer. But as he got older and got more responsibilities, a career, a marriage, kids, those mornings where he had to get up and get after it after a couple of IPAs suddenly became a little more challenging. Getting up to motivate for an early surf session or tea time just became more difficult. So he did some research, found a brewery that had the latest and most modern equipment to de-alc beer, and started developing recipes to make non-alcoholic beer that could go toe-to-toe with a solid full-strength beer. It took some time, but once he nailed the recipes after testing multiple batches with his friends, he took it to the market. And 3 years later, Best Day is in almost 40 states with one of the fastest growing non-alcoholic beer brands in the country. It's delicious stuff. And, I'm a lot like Tate. I like having a beer in the evening. It's just a ritual that helps me put a cap on the day and relax. But I found that in recent years, I just slept better and functioned better overall if I wasn't consistently consuming alcohol. And what Best Day does for me is it allows me to have the ritual without the side effects. So here's the deal that Best Day Brewing is offering to our listeners. You can get 20% off your first order at bestdaybrewing.com with code FriedEgg20. This offer excludes subscription orders, but otherwise, for your first order, 20% off with FriedEgg20. All right, let's get to David Normoyle. All right, David, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure, Garrett.
So in talking about the history of Cypress Point, I'd like to start pretty broad, bring some characters onto the stage, and then finally get to the building of the golf course. So first of all, who was Samuel Morse?
Well, Samuel Morse was a man from the East who found himself in the West. And that's the theme that I think runs through all of the main characters of this story, whether it's Samuel Morse, Marian Hollands, Roger Lapham, and even Alister MacKenzie. They all came from somewhere else. And because of their experiences at Cypress Point, and in particular the Monterey Peninsula, but Cypress Point, they made the rest of their lives on that portion of the world. So Samuel Morse was raised in Boston, educated at Yale. He was the captain of the undefeated Yale football team in 1906, and his hero was Teddy Roosevelt. And because of some connections that he made with classmates at Yale, from the Hammond family, and then more importantly, the Crocker family, which was one of the big four California families from the 1800s, the railroad barons and industrialists, he got a job working on ranches in California. And following in the model of his hero, Teddy Roosevelt, he loved being on horseback and working the land. And the Crockers happened to own this huge piece of land as part of the Pacific Improvement Company, which was an outgrowth of one of these great industrialist conglomerate corporations that owned thousands and thousands of acres on the Monterey Peninsula, including Pebble Beach, Cypress Point, and the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey. Unfortunately, because of a variety of different land complications, this Del Monte unit was hugely unprofitable, and so the Crockers were trying to get rid of it, to liquidate it. So they hired Sam Morse to come and be the manager of this land and to gussy it up so that it could be readied for sale to benefit the inheritors of this property. Except the problem was Sam Morse didn't want to sell it. He wanted to buy it because he had a vision for creating a Newport of the West, a sort of grand resort on the most beautiful piece of land. But unlike what had been done previously through the Pacific Improvement Company in Pacific Grove, as an example, chopping up the land into small pieces of real estate, what Morse wanted to do was preserve the best pieces of land for golf, which would then drive value of the real estate further inland. And he oversaw all of this as the Duke of Del Monte from 1915 until his death in 1969.
The Duke of Del Monte. I like that. That's how he was actually known. That's not your term for him.
No, he was kind of known as that around town. And some people say that he didn't like it. Some people say that he secretly embraced it. But he wore a lot of different hats as the developer of Del Monte. He, from his father, who fought in the Civil War, had a kind of pugilistic instinct. And from his mother, who was a sculptor, he was an artist. So a number of his original paintings, charcoal and oils, are hanging on the walls of the clubhouse at Cypress Point. So he balanced both. He approved every single planning or architectural plan in the Del Monte forest from 1915 to 1969. And he had his fingerprints on everything, including Cypress Point.
Could you give me a sense for the scope of his vision for Del Monte properties, for this kind of big, sort of resort attraction that he wanted to build in the Monterey area? Just the size of it, the extent of it.
Well, he started with the Hotel Del Monte, which was this grand Victorian structure built by Charles Crocker in the 1880s. And in the mid-1920s, it burned down, actually, and he was able to rebuild it in his preferred sort of neo-Spanish Californian style. And that's what really set the tone for a lot of what he was doing. But if you think about it, he realized that the best way to sell real estate was to people who had money. And he knew from the 1916 Western Amateur, which was played at the old Del Monte Golf Course, a historic golf course from the 1890s, right next to the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, he knew that wealthy people tended to travel to golf tournaments. And so he created this tiered structure where, beginning with the public access historic old Del Monte Golf Course, he then added a public access Pebble Beach golf links in 1919, which would drive visitors, bed stays, all of that to the newly rebuilt lodge. And then if you keep going up the pyramid, the idea was to build a 36-hole country club, the Monterey Peninsula Country Club, which came about starting in 1925. And that would be for local landowners, retired military people, people who wanted to buy smaller pieces of land. And then at the very pinnacle of his golf pyramid would be the exclusive Cypress Point Club on the most beautiful piece of land, limited to a smaller number, again, driving people to buy the most expensive and valuable lots. The only problem was he, as the president of the Del Monte Properties Company, couldn't be seen to promote both this private Cypress Point Club and Del Monte Properties. There needed to be an intermediary, and in Marian Hollands, Sam Morse found his ideal.
We'll get to Marian Hollands in a second. That was an excellent segue, but I'm gonna jam that for a second and ask about the kind of general role of golf in Morse's vision, because I think that maybe some listeners right now would be surprised to hear that these great golf courses, including Cypress Point, were sort of part of a real estate scheme, and real estate driven golf has a bit of a bad name now among golf architecture enthusiasts and golf purists. How was what Morse was doing with the combination of real estate and golf maybe different from what modern people would expect from that mixture?
Sure. When Sam Morse inherited the Del Monte unit project and turned it into the Del Monte Properties Company, there were plans to have hundreds of row houses on the headland where the 6th hole and 7th green at Pebble Beach are right now. So if you want to know what that would have looked like, go to Google Earth, look at what Pacific Grove looks like, just slightly to the north on the Monterey Peninsula, and imagine Pacific Grove on top of Pebble Beach golf links, because that's what the Del Monte Properties Company inherited, plans for that. But what Morse realized is if you preserve the most beautiful pieces of land for golf, open views, etc., and move the real estate further inland with a view of the Gulf and the sea beyond, that real estate will only continue to increase in value again and again, whereas the small properties you can only sell once. And one person who he convinced to do this was Robert Hunter, who bought and built a house designed by Wallace Neff on the 13th hole at Pebble Beach, overlooking the golf course with Point Lobos in the distance. And he became central to the Cypress Point story.
Okay, let's get back to Marian Hollands now. Sure. Who was Marian Hollands?
Marian Hollands was another child of the East who found herself in the West. She was born in New York City to great privilege in the 1890s. Her father, if you can imagine, was the founding president of the Metropolitan Golf Association, Harry B. Hollands, HB. And one of his great friends was the son of the Vanderbilts, who at the time were the wealthiest family in America. And he really saved their bacon on a finance deal in the 1880s. So as a consequence, he was able to build a 600-acre family homestead out on Long Island where Marian grew up, including having a small golf course on this amazing piece of land. And she did everything. She had only brothers, and she did everything. She was the classic tomboy who rode horses, learned to play polo, eventually became the only woman in America with a man's rated handicap at polo. But her strength was as a golfer. And she emerged around the same time as Bobby Jones on the national scene, finally breaking through in 1921 and winning the U.S. Women's Amateur. And during this time, as one of these great polo players and golfers, she would make occasional visits, including before World War I and after, out to Pebble Beach for the purpose of playing polo at Del Monte. And by the way, Sam Morse was captain of the Del Monte polo team, so he dabbled in this as well. So he knew Marian, and he engaged Marian slightly after she won the 1921 Women's Amateur to sell real estate. And essentially, she was I don't want to use the word shill, but she was the front person who would get her wealthy New York society friends to come out to Monterey and buy expensive real estate, which she did herself. And having developed the Women's National Golf and Tennis Club on Long Island with Deborah Emmett and ultimately Seth Raynor and Charles Blair Macdonald in the 1920s, she was perfectly poised to develop this exclusive private club at Cypress Point for Sam Morse.
Women's National was an incredible looking course. There are some vintage photos of this course that make it clear that it was a high quality golf course. Clearly, Hollands had very good taste in golf course design, knew how to choose a piece of land, and so she would seem to be very well suited to this new role in Morse's overall scheme. So how then was Cypress Point conceived? How did all the parties kind of come together, choose a property, and come up with the idea for this club?
Well, if you go back and do some research in late 1923 in Pacific Golf and Motor, there was an article by a guy named Francis McComas, who became a Cypress Point member. He was an artist, and he was best friends with Sam Morse. And in December of 1923, this is before all of the things that we think we know happen, he said that the history of the Pebble Beach courses dates back to 1914, when Crocker, one of these men, and Morse started talking about the possibilities. So they investigated a few holes, and they also said that favorable mention of the site of the present course, Pebble Beach, and also the land around Cypress Point, where eventually a third course will be built, was explored. Seth Raynor, one of the world's most distinguished golf architects with Miss Marian Hollands, recently spent time studying Cypress Point locality and reached the conclusion that as a material for a great golf course, it cannot be surpassed in America. So the idea of developing a golf course at Cypress Point began with the whole development of Pebble Beach and Del Monte in 1914, 1915-ish. But finally, the time arrived in 23, 24, and 25 to develop this golf course. Marian Hollands was engaged by Sam Morse to do the selling, and Seth Raynor was engaged as well because he was doing the work at Monterey Peninsula Country Club for the Del Monte Properties Company. And I would add also that Hollands would have known Raynor and McDonald because not only was her father the founding president of the Metropolitan Golf Association, but he joined every club in the New York area and was a founding member of the National Golf Links. So Marian had loads of access to the National Golf Links, understood the whole theory behind it, and when she went to develop her women's national golf course, she too traveled overseas playing in amateur tournaments and studied the great holes of the UK, just like Charles Blair Macdonald did with National Golf Links. So at the beginning, she was very much in the national school of thought. And you can read this in some of her writings about the Women's National, not so much the McKenzie naturalism, which we'll get to in a bit.
What can you tell me about how far Seth Raynor got into the design process and which aspects of the current Cypress Point course might be linked to his initial efforts? What can you tell me about all that?
Sure. Well, in 1923, 24, and again in 25, Raynor made visits for Monterey Peninsula and also visited the land at Cypress Point. And one of the pieces of interesting pieces of evidence that we found during the research is a newspaper article from the Los Angeles Evening Express in September of 1925. So Raynor, still very much alive. And the headline reads, "Wonder Golf Course. Miss Hollands' creation will be delightful. One hole calls for a long carry over a lake." Interestingly enough, that lake was the 16th hole, and
it wasn't a lake. Yeah,
it wasn't a lake.
Yeah.
But the way to think about it is this: from the beginning, the founders, Hollands, Morse, and everybody else, knew that the clubhouse was going to be where the clubhouse was going to be, which was on a rise, on a relatively flat piece of land, overlooking Cypress Point on one side, overlooking Fanshell Beach, which is the cove where the first green is. That's Fanshell Beach on the other side, and then the Cypress Grove. So there was always going to be the clubhouse there on that beautiful spot. And then when you think of the name of the course, the name of the club, the Cypress Point Club, holes were always going to be played along Cypress Point. So the big question is, if you know where the clubhouse is and you know that you're going to play the holes along Cypress Point, are you going to play them clockwise to begin, down the hill, around them and then go play the inland holes? Or are you going to play them counterclockwise to finish? You only have two choices. And from beginnings of recorded history, photographs, before there was ever a golf course, were always taken from the land looking out to Cypress Point for the 16th green. There were never photographs taken from the point looking back to the land because it's inherently less dramatic. So from this beginning point, Seth Raynor was involved, Marian was involved. They always knew that the 16th hole was going to be played in the direction that it is, counterclockwise to finish. So the big question becomes, what do you do with the other 14 holes on the other side of the road? Because if you're going to have those 4 holes along Cypress Point, which, with all due respect, my mother-in-law would have designed exactly the same way that Seth Raynor and Marian Hollands and Alister MacKenzie did, because there's really only one way to play them. The question is, what do you do on the other side? And Seth Raynor did a routing of the other holes, and it was described in this article. And I'll tell you some of the things that were said. So this Los Angeles Evening Express from September of 1925 reads, the former champion, Marian Hollands, is convinced with the assistance of Seth Raynor, golf architect of national note, that she hopes to construct a creation which will even surpass such notable lengths as Lido and the National. National was always held up as the standard, which new developments were trying to match. It reads, the first 9 holes will lead into the virgin forest, which contains innumerable kinds of trees of great age, and is interesting to learn that those which are doomed to be cut down have been sold to private parties by Miss Hollands. The article continues, from the forest lane, the links will lead down to the water's edge along mountains of that glorious white sand, which particularly belongs to that district, as do the cypress trees. The greatest hole in the links will probably be the 16th, which calls for a carry of 180 yards clean over the bay. So the article describes the routing as going 9 holes into the forest and then back along the mountains of sand. If you want to know exactly what Seth Raynor's routing was, in the upcoming Centennial history book that the club is producing, there will be a routing map so that you can see exactly what he did. However, the more interesting thing is not what Seth Raynor may or may not have done, but what Alister MacKenzie actually did. And when you think about the 4 holes that go around Cypress Point, we've already determined there's really only one way to do counterclockwise to finish. Then the question becomes, what do you do inland? You've got 1 hole leading away from the clubhouse, the first. You've got another hole leading back to Cypress Point, the 14th. So you have 12 holes that you have to do something interesting with. And according to that article, Raynor took 9 of them and went into the forest. Well, if you think about how McKenzie ended up designing it, and this is where the story becomes remarkable, when Alister MacKenzie got on a ship in January of 1926 to sail to New York City, to visit America, to see his design partners, Perry Maxwell and Robert Hunter in San Francisco ultimately, when he did this, Seth Raynor was still alive. On the way across the country on the train, Seth Raynor dies. 6 days after Seth Raynor dies and Marian Hollands no longer has an architect for Cypress Point, Alister MacKenzie arrives in San Francisco to meet Robert Hunter. And a couple of days after that, February 2nd, he comes and visits Cypress Point for the first time. He's there briefly, but long enough to create a new routing map and a new design with details of bunkers and greens and a routing that incorporates some of the features we're about to talk about in a way that makes it possible for Albert Barrows to draw that famous aerial map that you see in 1926. And MacKenzie didn't return to Cypress Point again for another year, 1927. So he was there only briefly, but long enough to design all of the features and change the routing to a degree where it looks kind of like it does today. However, there were a few changes during construction. So the key thing to think about when you're trying to understand how Cypress Point works as a golf course is there are 3 main environments. You've got the sea, the sand, and the forest. And you're constantly moving from one environment to the next. Sea, sand, forest. And only when you play the holes at Cypress Point do you visit those once. And all the other elements from 2 through 14, you visit those features multiple times. You come to them and from them and away from them. And the way that McKenzie and Hunter made this possible is that every single hole on the other side of 17 Mile Drive from Cypress Point, so holes 1 through 14, Every single hole plays to a dune or from a dune. Every single one, except for the fifth. And the reason the most dramatic bunkering on the entire golf course is on the fifth is because it's the only hole where you have no contact with a natural dune. So 1 plays to a dune, 2 plays from a dune, 3 plays to a dune, 4 plays from a dune, 5, you're truly in the forest, 6 to the dune, 7 from it, 8 over and in it, 9 plays to the core of McKenzie and Hunter's central dune, 10 plays from it, 11 plays to it, and 12 plays away from it. 13, you rejoin the fan shell dune, that first central dune, the first bit of the dune, and then 14 plays away from it. So all of those holes are really dune holes, and McKenzie talked about it in March of 1927, writing in Game and Gossip, which is Sam Morse's local magazine. McKenzie said, and this is before construction ever began, "We shall play over inlets of the sea, turn into the pine woods, and then into high dunes, and back again to a club looking into the endless expanse of a great ocean. 5 holes skirting the sea or flirting with its waves, 5 holes in the pine woods, and 8 greens in the dunes. Where else shall we find all of this?" And so if you want to try and understand the difference between what McKenzie did and what Raynor may or may not have done, just think of the description. For Raynor, 9 holes led into the forest. For McKenzie, 5. He also planted 8 greens in the dunes. Do you have any of your grandmother's old recipes?
Oh, of
So
course.
if you know the ingredients, you know the recipe, when you make it, does it taste the same?
No.
Because just knowing the recipe or just knowing the routing is not the same as creating the whole thing. I mean, architecture is a combination of routing, yes, but also design. So the shapes of the bunkers, the people who shape the bunkers, and then ultimately construction. And I think one of the remarkable things about how Cypress Point was created is that McKenzie acknowledged that almost all of the greens and fairways and tees were artificially constructed. It's just that you don't know it. He was the magician trying to hide his work in plain sight, and that was the intent. That's what I think made it such a transformative golf course.
It was that kind of contribution of naturalness and seamlessness, which was, McKenzie's trademark. Obviously, many of our listeners will know who Alister MacKenzie was, but if we can backtrack a little bit, who was he by the mid 1920s? How would you characterize the stage of his career that he was in at that point that he got the Cypress Point commission?
So he arrived in San Francisco in late January, February of 1926. So this is ground zero from an American golf perspective. He had never built a golf course prior to that moment. And so when Marian Hollands and Sam Morse went to build Cypress Point, they, of course, would not have gone to McKenzie. They would have gone to Seth Raynor and Charles Blair Macdonald because they were the leading architects in America at the time. But with Raynor's passing, a pivot was required. And it's not just that McKenzie was an interesting character. It's also that Robert Hunter, his design partner, who lived in Pebble Beach and at the very same time was coming out with his own book on architecture, The Links, which in April of that year, just a couple of months after McKenzie and Hunter visited Cypress Point for the first time, Hunter hand-inscribed a copy of The Links to Samuel Morse. So as much of an expert as McKenzie was, Hunter in California was equally so an expert in golf architecture. But at the time, McKenzie had designed a number of golf courses in the UK, but really had not expanded beyond that. He hadn't gone on his trip to Australia yet. He hadn't built anything in America. He had just done the UK-based work and wrote his book, Golf Architecture, along with a number of other articles. And so it was really this opportunity to make his debut in California in 1926 that set things running. But at the time, he had nothing special to claim on his own. So it was really an almost providential visit that he happened to be en route to California at the time of Raynor's passing.
So a lot of luck factored into his earning of this opportunity, in other words.
Huge amounts. But then he went and constructed a number of golf courses in California, starting with the Meadow Club, He did bunker work at the California Golf Club, Cal Club, reconstructed a number of greens after the initial construction was done by Vernon McCann, did Cypress Point, did some work at Pebble Beach, did some work at Monterey Peninsula, Valley Club, on and on and on, and then ultimately Paso Tiempo, where he resided towards the end of his life. A number of other courses in California, too.
So this McKenzie-Hunter partnership was very dynamic. How would you characterize the work that they did generally in California from a stylistic perspective? In other words, what was distinctive about the work that they did together as opposed to the work that McKenzie did with, say, Perry Maxwell in the Midwest or with Alex Russell and others in Australia? What did this kind of partnership produce?
Well, the key unifying feature in all of this was the company that Hunter and McKenzie formed, the American Golf Course Construction Company. And Neil Crafter and Sean Tully have done far more research and written about it far better than I ever will. In fact, there's a great article in the Australian Golf Course Architects Journal that from 2017 or 2018 that Sean and Neil did that covers all of this. But I think the key thing is, as McKenzie was building golf courses in the UK, he was dissatisfied with the quality of construction. So he and his brother founded the British Golf Course Construction Company. And then this created the model for Hunter to do the American Golf Course Construction Company. And McKenzie brought over a number of his associates, who all happen to be Irish for whatever reason, to be the lead shapers and builders. So it was Hunter, Hunter's son, Robert Hunter Jr., and then the key names, at least on the Cypress Point project, were Jack Fleming, who they all stayed in California, by the way. Jack Fleming, Dan Gormley, the key bunker shaper in all of the Cypress Point work was a fellow called Paddy Cole, and then Michael McDonough, all Irishmen. And I think extreme naturalism is the word that I would use to describe this. These were high-flying times where real estate was going for immense amounts of money. And even though they were trying to be very responsible with their costs, and actually McKenzie felt it was outrageous how much money was being wasted on golf courses, they took risks. And they had pieces of land on which to take remarkable risks. But I think it was everything having to do with the American Golf Course Construction Company and these core people who built these golf courses, why you see a different style than you might see elsewhere.
Okay, so McKenzie had this great crew with him capable of producing incredibly naturalistic shapes in the landscape. Now they get a hold of a property like Cypress Point. Let's talk about construction a little bit. What were the major changes that McKenzie and his crew made to the landscape at Cypress Point? I think, and to contextualize this question a little bit, I think people regard the Cypress Point property as one of the great natural golf properties, and it is probably that. But unless I'm mistaken, they did, move some dirt around.
Oh, yeah. They moved a lot of dirt, and they had to. So Hunter he was a professor at the University of California before he retired as a sociologist. And he had relationships with University of California professors. Berkeley's not that far from the Monterey Peninsula. And he worked with a number of scientists at Berkeley to develop test plots for what types of turf grasses they would want to use. So some of the sand dunes are beautiful for native grasses, but they're not great for building brand new turf. Charles Blair Macdonald found this to be the case at National Golf Links. George Crump at Pine Valley. Establishing great grass on sand was one of the key breakthroughs in American golf course construction. So from a starting point, you had sea, sand, and forest. You had the rocky cliffs, you had the sand dunes, and you had the forest in this ancient drainage ravine. And so you had to find a way to move essentially arable land to grow grass to all these different places to make that happen. So that was thing number one. Thing number two is the property lines for this development were in some ways shifting. You had 17 Mile Drive. You had some lack of clarity about exactly where the dunes on 6, 7, and 8 are. And so originally, the sixth hole was not meant to be a back-to-back par 5 like it is today. It was meant to be a par 3. But during construction, they realized that actually the property line behind the 7th green and the 8th tee made it possible for the 7th green to become the par 3 that went up into the dunes, the 8th tee extending up above it, allowing for an even more heroic carry over that shoulder of the sand dune. And so that's why you have those back-to-back par fives in 5 and 6. So changing 6 and 7 and 8 to be what they are would be one of the major changes. And then the other one was the consequence of the rerouting of the road, about which I think there's more confusion than there needs to be, near the 14th green. So if you look at the earliest plans, the green for number 14 was going to be about where the middle of the curve of the road is. It was like a 420-yard hole instead of a 385-yard hole. But because of the sharpness of the curve that was going around the green, almost encircling it like an island, this was part of the source of frustration for Morse and his highway foreman, thinking that people were going to be killed with traffic coming so close to the edge of the green. So what they decided to do was soften the curve slightly, which required Hunter, McKenzie wasn't there, by the way, to move the 14th green down to its current location, build it up. There's a letter on McKenzie and Hunter letterhead, which is in the book, which describes all of his thinking about this. Moved the 14th green down, which slightly shortened it. Took the 13th hole, which was meant to be a par 3 initially, made it into a par 4. Took the 12th, meant to be a par 5, shortened it to a par 4, going all the way back to that tee. So there was a sequence of changes as a result of that. But the other thing, by routing the road where it was, is it didn't allow them to build the tee out on the water on 15 like they had perhaps originally intended. I mean, early, before they got to where they are with McKenzie. Plus, there was the cost of doing so. So that lower tee that you play today, that was installed in the 1950s. So that's one of the, we'll call it major changes. The other major tee change will be the creation of the 9th tee. So when you look at the 8th green, that upper tier to the left, that used to be the 9th tee. There's a great photo that we did in the book of McKenzie playing it sort of smashed together with the guys coming up number 8, which really shows how the connection was made. But other than that, for the most part, a few things here and there, but the golf course is essentially as designed by McKenzie and Hunter when it opened in 1928.
What was the basic time frame of construction?
So one of the ways to think about the gestation period of Cypress Point, essentially, is it was a 5-year period from 1925 to 1930. So key things happened in each of those years, which are worth noting. 1925 is the kickoff because that's when Marian Hollands takes out the option on the land from the Del Monte Properties Company and starts signing up members. In fact, the routing from Seth Raynor was February of 1925, so very early. However, a number of things happened in 1925 and 26, which slowed things down, including Marian hurting her back, purportedly playing polo. And so the membership drive stalled, and the whole thing was in danger of collapsing until a young salesman named Harrison Godwin, who ended up being a local fixture in the Carmel area, owner of the Pine Inn, he was the one, as a 20-something, who took the project over the line and signed up the 100 members required in order to fund construction. So McKenzie comes in 1926, does the design, but again, it's not until the next year, 1927, when they finally have enough people signed up to pay for the thing. So construction begins after the club is formally incorporated in July of 1927. Construction begins that fall in October, November, and is largely completed by April of the following year. McKenzie came just for the 3rd time to check it all out and to take photos when that was occurring. And the golf course opened for play in August of 1928. So once they got going, from late 1927 to opening in August of 1928, it all happened remarkably quickly.
Yeah. Is there any sense of how that happened? That is such a compressed time frame for the construction of a golf course.
Well, one of the reasons why it happened is because Robert Hunter lived in Pebble Beach. He was there. He was overseeing, along with his son, Robert Hunter Jr., all of the construction. And so he had a deeply vested interest. And not only, it's sort of like Hair Club for Men, not only was he a client, he was also a member of Cypress Point. So he wanted it to go particularly well. And at the same time, there's another character in this story who I think does not get the credit he deserves, and that's Roger Lapham. So Roger Lapham was so-called the Brahmin of San Francisco golf. He was the USGA executive committee member on the West Coast from around 1922 to 1929. He was the one responsible for getting the U.S. Amateur to come to Pebble Beach in 1929. He was part of the three-man committee that redid Pebble Beach in 1928 in preparation for the Amateur. The other people were Robert Hunter and Chandler Egan, who ended up being McKenzie's design partner after Hunter retired. So Lapham was the director of Cypress Point, who was responsible for golf course construction. There's a great letter in the book from Lapham to Hunter Jr. thanking them for the work that they did. And so I think it was Lapham being there, it was Hunter being there, it was Hunter Jr. being there, and it was also the incredibly favorable growing climate of the Monterey Peninsula for year-round golf.
In addition to the quickness of the construction period, McKenzie also ended up being very proud of the economy of the construction process, how efficient it was financially. So how did the crew achieve this? Was it part of the same reason that, Robert Hunter was there overseeing things? Are there some other factors we should be aware of how exactly Cypress Point was built so cheaply and, as I understand it, under budget?
It was under budget, and it came in, under budget and ahead of schedule. And they used modern construction techniques. They used equipment that they could be more efficient instead of having to use manual labor, though reportedly they still used up to 100 laborers at a time to dynamite trees and clear forest and all that sort of stuff. But I think it was just the efficiency of the team that had trained and worked together, and also Hunter's advanced research on what grasses would work. And so when they actually went to plant the golf course, it took, unlike Pine Valley, which failed, unlike National Golf Links, which failed, all of which adds cost.
Yeah, I mean, that the grow-in is probably the single most underrated factor in golf course construction in this golden age of golf architecture. It was always grow-in that was the problem.
And they nailed it. And if you look at the descriptions of the golf course from 1928 and 29, they say it was the most perfectly conditioned golf course in America. Now, I mean, you didn't have the mutations and 100 years of introducing all sorts of other elements and the coastal challenges, but it was, when it opened, it was perfect. It's a miracle that Cypress Point even exists. I mean, if you think about it, and this is something that we talk about in the book, is there was a small moment in time when it became possible to hit a golf shot from one precipice of a great ocean to the other. Because if it happened any other time during that gestation period from 1925 to 1930, so you've got Marian Hollands, the option in 1925, McKenzie enters the picture in 26, the club incorporates in 27, the course opens in 28, the U.S. Amateur 29, and then the clubhouse finally opens in 1930. If it happens at any other moment between that narrow window of time, it's not possible. Because any time before that, Pebble Beach was immature and would not have been ready from a real estate standpoint to have the number of people required to support it. So it would have been dead on arrival. Anytime after 1930, and because of the Depression, I mean, the club barely survived in the first place. Now imagine coming out of World War II and just assume it wasn't claimed by the military. There was a naval sea observation tower, which was placed on the property for viewing submarines during the war. So think of its, strategic location. Imagine that clubhouse, understated George Washington Smith, his ode to old Monterey stucco with white stucco and green shutters. Imagine that in the modernist 50s and 60s. Imagine the Coastal Commission making it possible to build a golf course in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or today. The point is, if it didn't happen in that narrow window of 5 years, you would never have had a chance to hit a golf shot on the 16th hole.
So how was the course received when it opened? Was it immediately recognized as one of the world's great courses?
Immediately and astoundingly, somewhat to the disappointment of Alister MacKenzie, who was looking for more criticism. And the fact that it withstood no criticism whatsoever kind of made him feel like maybe he missed something. But when you take that setting and when you take those elements, the sea, the sand, the forest, the routing, the setting of the clubhouse, and then what evolved over the next 100 years, it was remarkable. However, if you go back 50 years, to when, say, the late 1970s in the Walker Cup in 1981, McKenzie had fallen out of favor. There was a letter that Lewis Lapham, who was the son of Roger Lapham and who went around with McKenzie as a teenager with a carpet and hit tee shots to determine what the carry angles should be on various holes for where the tees should be positioned. In the 1970s, he wrote a letter suggesting that half of the members of Cypress Point wouldn't know who designed the golf course. They wouldn't know who McKenzie was. And so it was really because of a lot of things independent of Cypress Point and Alister MacKenzie, the discovery of his manuscript and the publication of Spirit of St. Andrews in 1995, the formation of the Alister MacKenzie Society, various books, whether it was by Tom Doak and Raymond Haddock about Alister MacKenzie, or the work and the research from George Botto that's gone into MacDonald and Raynor, that this revival and interest of these people has in turn created a kind of revival and interest in places like Cypress Point, which when you look at the rankings from the 70s and early 80s, it was outside the top 10 and barely in the top 50 in various rankings. But since the mid-1980s, post-Walker Cup and beyond, it's consistently remained in about the top 5 in America.
Well, David, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Pleasure talking to you, and good luck with finishing the book. I'm very much looking forward to your centennial book on Cypress Point. It'll contain I think a lot of answers to many questions I've had over the years.
Well, the good news is the book is finished, but we're just waiting for the Walker Cup to be played because we can't quite write that chapter yet. As soon as it is, then we'll go to print.
This episode of Designing Golf is brought to you by Red Rooster golf gloves. So I want to tell you about a very cool opportunity that Red Rooster is offering. You can win a golf getaway to Streamsong Golf Resort in Florida. No purchase necessary. This is something that Red Rooster is running. Really cool. So from August 13th to October 31st, 2025, that's the year that we're in right now, you can enter for a chance to win a 2-night golf getaway at the world-renowned Streamsong Golf Resort in Florida. Courses designed by Tom Doak, Corin Crenshaw, and Gil Hance. Really cool place. Red Rooster is sending 3 lucky winners, and each winner can bring a guest. That's 6 people heading to one of the coolest golf destinations in the world. The trip takes place December 30th, 2025 to January 1st, 2026. There are 3 ways to enter. 1, the Golden Glove Contest. You can buy any Red Rooster golf glove. If a Golden Glove arrives with your purchase, you're on the short list for the grand prize draw. One of 28 Golden Glove recipients will be randomly selected to win. The Golden Gloves are real Cabretta leather gloves. They're not photos or stickers. The second way to enter the contest, you can refer a friend. Go to redroostergolf.com and click Refer a Friend. Share your unique referral link. Each successful referral, that is, your friend makes their first Red Rooster golf purchase, earns you an entry. One winner from this group will be drawn, and they can also bring a friend. The third way is to enter with your email. So visit redroostergolf.com/win-a-trip, all one word, win a trip. Enter your email address for a chance to win. One winner from this group will be drawn, and yes, they too can bring a friend. So learn more about this great golf getaway opportunity at redroostergolf.com/win-a-trip. All right, let's get back to the episode. All right, so it's just me and my producer, Will Balsam now. Will, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to make the first appearance.
Yeah, and I'm not doing you very much justice here because basically I have a lot of notes that I want to get through. I'll be talking a lot here, but it's also nice to have a sounding board so I'm not just in my head doing a monologue. It's nice to have somebody to bounce things off of, and so jump in whenever you want, ask questions. You're kind of the audience surrogate here. Does that all sound good?
Yeah, I'll do my best for the rest of the listeners.
Okay. All right. So as usual in these deep dives, I like to break things down into categories. So we'll touch on the land, the routing, the philosophy of the design at Cypress Point, the aesthetics, the greens, the agronomy a little bit, and the restoration work that has recently been done. So let's dig in here, start with the land. So there are, as David Normoyle mentioned in my chat with him, 3 distinct landscapes at Cypress Point. You have the ocean cliffs, the dunes, and the woods, or as David put it, sea, sand, and forest. The dunes are part of one large formation that cuts like a wedge into the course. The dunes holes actually at Spyglass Hill, 1 through 5 and 2 through 4, sit on the same dune formation just a little bit to the north. Within Cypress Point's section of this dune formation, there are a couple of specific subsections. So there's a high, very prominent ridge. The 8th and 9th holes sit on top of this. The 3rd, 6th, and 11th greens are either benched into it or near it. The 12th hole plays around it. So this is really the focal point of the property. This very obvious, abrupt dune ridge. But then there's a lower set of dunes and sandy material kind of off to the side. And that's where the 1st, 2nd, 13th, and 14th holes are. And finally, a separate but related, very large dune ridge running east to west. So the dune ridge that I talked about before, that's kind of in the middle of the course, runs north-south. This one runs east-west, bordering the north side of the golf course, kind of near the 6th hole. This is where that trail is that I mentioned earlier, that I used to load my son into like a hiking backpack, and we would go hike on this dune above Cypress Point. And this very big dune ridge, it's less abrupt, less dramatic to look at, but it's very large. The 7th green and the 8th tee sit on this ridge. So that's the duneland section of the course. Does that kind of make sense? These different areas of the dune?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Then you have the inland forest section to the west, pretty large scale undulating topography. And then finally, you have the seaside portion of the property to the west, a spectacular series of capes and bays, very well sized for golf. So dunes in the middle, forest to the east, ocean cliffs to the west. It's just an extraordinarily varied and beautiful property. And that's basically what was there before the golf course was built.
Seems like the perfect piece of land for a world-class golf course.
It was a great piece of land for a golf course, and McKenzie recognized that right away. He saw that this had huge potential to be his best golf course, potentially. But at the same time, I think it was also kind of tricky because it was, the variety of the property is both a strength and a weakness in a way. Because yes, it is exciting that it's so varied, and you have these great ocean cliffs, and you have the dunes, and you have it's all there, you can use all of it, but it's also a little bit disjointed. And so there's the potential that the golf course could kind of be awkward, right? It's not like, it's not a piece of links land like Royal Portrush sits on, or that the old course sits on at a lower profile, where there's kind of this consistent rumple, and you can almost put golf holes. You can't put them anywhere, and there are some combinations that are better than others, but there are a lot of options to make a golf course work there. At the Cypress Point property, I'm not sure there were many great solutions to the equation of the property, because it had these different characters to it. You had to do something to make it all work together. So that brings us to the routing of Cypress Point. Now, David already discussed this beautifully in the history section of the episode. I don't think I could really improve on that description. But basically, what's brilliant about the routing of this course is how it alternates between different landscapes without ever feeling disjointed. As David pointed out, all of the inland holes except number 5 have some relationship with that central dune formation. The course is continually playing into, off of, around, and onto this big slice of duneland. And what makes the course a unified and coherent experience is that there's not a clean separation between the duneland holes and the forest holes. Holes like 2, 3, 4, 6, 10, 11, and 14 are part of two environments at once, or transition between them. They're both part of the forest and the dunes. They have elements of both landscapes in them. So they sort of function like segues in writing, right? They provide these links between different ideas so that the whole piece hangs together and doesn't seem choppy. But that sort of changes after the 14th hole. There is a clear separation between the first 14 holes and the last 4 on the ocean. You literally walk across 17-mile drive and down a little path before arriving at the 15th tee. And then you walk through another path to get to the 16th tee. And for me, this works from a dramatic perspective. There's this pause while you're being set up for the big finale. And of course, the ensuing reveals on the 15th hole and the 16th hole are incredibly exciting. To get to both tees, you walk along these really compressed paths lined by cypress trees, and then boom, everything falls away, and you get these panoramic views of the cliffs and the ocean. So there's a sense of compression and release. And this is an example of how the routing at Cypress Point, I think, creates anticipation and drama, and just has a beautiful sense of rising and falling action, right? You start off with some excitement on the first hole with a downhill tee shot, a view of the ocean, and a green benched into a dune. The next 2 holes show you the big dune ridge and a lot of the rest of the course, giving you a preview of coming attractions. Then you wander away from that environment and into the forest for a couple of slightly quieter holes, though still plenty dramatic because the bunkering is so outrageous on the 4th and 5th holes. The 6th hole brings you back to the dunes, and the 7th, 8th, and 9th play right on top of them. This is the most exciting stretch on the course aside from 15 through 17. Then it quiets down a little bit. 2 side-by-side longer holes in 10 and 11, playing out to the forest again and then back. And then 12 starts the journey out to the ocean. Once you round the corner of the dune ridge on the 12th hole, you see the amazing 13th green and the uphill 14th hole behind it. And you know what's beyond those holes, but you can't see it. So the anticipation is building and building. You hit the ocean on 15, 16, and 17. And then the course decides not to end with a huge flourish. Instead, you get the 18th hole climbing back up through the trees to the clubhouse. And I think this is sort of an unexpected choice for a golf course. A lot of great golf courses end with a bang, right? The 18th at Pebble Beach, one of the best examples. But it's not an unusual choice for narrative art in general, like movies and novels. Often movies and novels end with falling action, with a denouement, right? Which is the word that maybe an English teacher made you learn at some point. The routing of a golf course is a narrative, right? It can be compared to storytelling. So ending with a denouement, like 18 at Cypress Point, can work well. And I think it does work well. I think the line that Cypress Point is the best 17-hole course in the world is a little wrong-headed, because Cypress is a complete 18-hole experience and every hole plays its part, including the 18th. Not every hole is trying to be the most spectacular. They're just all working together to create this beautiful cadence and a wonderful story. So that's the kind of dramatic element of Cypress's routing. What do you think of ending with an 18th hole that maybe seems a little bit out of character and is clearly not as spectacular as the holes that come just before it? Do you find that to be something that you would like, or no?
I have recently found that I'm not as hard pressed by the 18th hole, as long as you have a stretch leading up to it that gives you some dramatic climax and ending. I think there are a lot of great golf courses that 15, 16, 17 are like these great finishing holes that really test you. But sometimes it's all right for 18 to maybe not reach those standards. And also routing is such a tough thing. You have to most of the time end up back where you started. So you can understand why that may be.
Right.
My preference though is not to end on a par 3. So as long as it's not that, I think you're okay.
There are some good courses that end on par 3s though, Pasatiempo being one of them. But
yes, Boston Golf Club as well.
Yeah, Boston Golf Club, exactly. Very good. Yeah, it's a rarity, I suppose, in general, though. I think the 18th at Cypress is interesting because it has to get you back up to the clubhouse. And that's what a lot of 18th holes do. That's kind of what you're referring to, right? Where the 18th hole, unlike the holes before it, has a job. And its job is to get you back to the clubhouse, get you back to the starting point. And at Cypress, it does that job, and clearly nothing that could be built on that piece of land could possibly live up to 15, 16, and 17. There was no possibility that hole was going to feel anything but slightly disappointing in comparison to those holes. And so McKenzie made an interesting choice not to force it, just to kind of route this hole through the trees. It's a very tight hole. It requires a really precisely shaped shot. A lot of people just don't like the hole at all, but I think it's kind of different. It really makes you shape your tee shot right to left, or choose maybe to go over the trees, find that left side of the fairway so that you have a clear approach up the hill through the trees. And it's a different challenge, and I think an interesting choice to end the golf course. He didn't try to overexert himself design-wise with that hole. All right, so now that we've talked about land and routing, let's get into some of the philosophy of design. So individual holes and how they're designed. And I want to touch on 3 aspects of Alister MacKenzie's design. First, his use of strategic architecture. Second, his commitment to playability. And third, his approach to the visual and aesthetic composition of his holes. So first of all, Cypress Point is very much an example of the strategic school of golf course design. You always have an option to play safe, but if you take a risk, you're rewarded with an easier next shot. Big, diagonal, natural hazards appear on holes 2, 8, 12, and 17. This is a classic strategic dilemma where, because you're hitting diagonally across a natural hazard, a dune or a rock ridge like on 2, or the ocean cliffs like on 17, because that hazard is oriented diagonally to the tee, you have to choose what line to take. And you're free to take the easy route, the short carry, or you can take on the long carry, and reliably on each of those holes, you gain an advantage if you bite off more of the hazard. So strategic architecture 101, basically on those holes. There are also holes where bunkers are positioned right where you want to play. The 6th hole is a very interesting example, I think. It has a big bunker off the tee on the right side, but the hole bends to the left. Jeff Shackelford actually talks about this in the video that we released a couple of days ago on our YouTube channel. The hole bends to as a dogleg left, and so you'd think that the advantage would be cutting the dogleg. But you actually get an advantage from carrying this bunker on the right, because beyond that bunker and concealed by the bunker is a kicker slope that can feed your ball down to an ideal position to attack the hole from there. So that's an example where a bunker just sits very near the landing zone that is most advantageous. Again, strategic architecture 101. The 9th hole is a classic strategic par 4. The closer you push toward the green, the more trouble you can get into, but the green is so severe that you really don't want to be approaching it from a long way back. So 9, definitely a hole to keep an eye on in the Walker Cup, because I think it'll be pretty exciting. And I think that the telecast will probably be aware that this is a hole to focus on, that they don't need to keep the cameras always on 15 and 16 and 17. So Cypress Point really it represents McKenzie's commitment to strategic design, and McKenzie himself thought very highly of the tactical questions that the course puts to the player. As I mentioned toward the beginning of the episode, he compared Cypress Point favorably to the old course at St. Andrews, which McKenzie saw as the exemplar of strategic risk-reward architecture. Another and I think related similarity that McKenzie saw between Cypress Point and the old course was playability. He wrote, Cypress Point shares with the old course at St. Andrews the distinction of being just as pleasurable to the dub as the scratchman. At no place is there a compulsory carry of more than 80 yards, but at many holes there are voluntary carries of 200 to 250 yards, tempting the long drivers to great rewards. So McKenzie believed very strongly in golf courses delivering the greatest pleasure to the greatest number. And in Cypress Point, you have a course that can be navigated successfully by the average player, but also provides optional but tempting challenges for more skilled players to keep their interest and deliver them the pleasure of overcoming challenges. The most obvious example of this is the famous long par 3 16th hole. So yes, very difficult to reach this green with one shot, even today with our juiced up equipment, but you always have the option to hit 150 to 180 yard shot out to a generous fairway on the left and play a pitch into the green. Almost anybody could play the hole pretty successfully that way. So Cypress Point is appealing to many levels of player, though I think as you'll see in the Walker Cup, it's not a long golf course, and some of those wonderful strategic elements that are relevant to me and to most of our listeners might not be super relevant to 20-year-olds who hit it 350, but that's a technological problem. I think that's a USGA problem, an RNA problem, not a Cypress Point problem. Yes, they're going to be carrying bunkers that McKenzie may have never imagined that they would carry, but look, it's not really his fault. He did his best to create a golf course that would stand the test of time. And for most of us, I think it has. All right. The last part of McKenzie's philosophy of design at Cypress Point that I want to touch on is the visual element. So first, you have some classic McKenzie visual deception on many holes. McKenzie believed in creating golf courses that looked more difficult than they actually were, so that mentally strong players could gain an advantage over the merely physically strong player. And so that players could have the pleasure of overcoming a difficult looking hazard, even if the task wasn't as hard as it appeared, right? We all like to do something that looks difficult, even if we're just kind of fooling ourselves that it actually is difficult. And that's McKenzie's use of visual deception, or why he does it. And the best examples of this at Cypress Point are the 4th and 5th holes, I think. Both appear from the tee to be just these fields of bunkers. It looks like there's very little room to play between the bunkers. But when you get up to the fairway, you realize that the bunkers are shaped and arranged in a way that conceals how roomy the landing zones actually are. But I think even more than visual deception, which is something that people talk a lot about when it comes to McKenzie, his greatest visual accomplishment at Cypress Point was the blending of the artificial and the natural. Obviously, McKenzie's associate, Robert Hunter, and their construction team deserve a lot of credit for this too. But I would say Cypress Point is the most beautifully shaped golf course that I know of from the golden age of golf architecture. I don't know if it was ever done better than this. Maybe more recently, Corin Crenshaw and Tom Doak's teams have kind of reached this level. But in the 19 teens and 20s, I'm not sure anybody got to quite this level. It's just pitch perfect tie-ins between the bunkers and the greens and the surrounding landforms. It's just stunning.
The 7th hole, I feel like, is that one. You just can't believe where that green is for such a what seems reasonably short par 3 for nowadays, and it looks like it was meant to be there.
Yeah, it's so beautifully blended into that big dune ridge, right? And that was actually a hole that came about later in the design process. Initially, there was a par 3 6th hole that was kind of in the forest, but I think they probably just got up on that dune and saw this shot across to the bigger dune ridge, and were like, "Well, look at that. That looks amazing."
It looks so daunting but beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put how Cypress Point looks in general. It does look like a very daunting golf course, but it's gorgeous. It is aesthetically fine-tuned to a degree that I'm not sure golf architecture has ever equaled. Okay, I want to say a few things now about the green designs at Cypress Point. By McKenzie's standards, and especially by the standards of his late career work, the greens at Cypress Point are fairly subtle. They're not huge, and a lot of them just tilt in a certain direction or have a single big tier. Some of them are quite severe to the point that it's hard in some cases to keep the ball on the green if you're putting down a slope, but they're not nearly as intricate as the greens McKenzie and Hunter built at Pasatiempo or Augusta National. There are a couple of exceptions to this at Cypress. The 8th green is pretty ambitious. It's a lot like a CB Macdonald and Seth Raynor maiden template, which means there's a low front section and 2 raised platforms in the back with a channel between them. So 3 basic pin positions: front, center, back left, back right. So that's a fairly crazy green. And then you have the 15th green, which has this odd amoeba shape with the tongues jutting out between bunkers. It was a style that McKenzie and Hunter later used at Pasatiempo and that McKenzie employed at Augusta National as well in the original version of that golf course. And you see it there on the 15th green at Cypress Point, but not really at many other greens. In general, Cypress's greens are simple and elegant. And I think that suits the property and the course well. There's so much interest in the land and the bunkers, so much interest in what's going on with the routing, the undulations in the fairways. You just don't need wild greens. And in fact, wild greens might distract from what you want the golfer to be focusing on, which is those big strengths of Cypress, the land and the routing. That said, I do think the greens were slightly more complex in McKenzie's day. And that leads me to the issue of restoration work at Cypress. Now, Cypress is a very well-preserved golf course. And this is something that the club emphasizes. We never rebuilt our golf course, is what they say. And that is true. Cypress Point still has its original push-up greens, and the turf, which was initially Astoria bent grass, has evolved over the past century. It just basically stayed in place. There's more POA now than there used to be. That's mostly just an inevitability on the California coast. That bent grass is going to evolve into this kind of POA mixture. But there's never been a big returfing project where some modern strain was installed. Clearly, though, the course did gradually drift away from its original design. Some trees were planted, some bunkers got smaller or were just lost. A lot of greens shrank to basically circles. So just, attrition over time, maintenance practices. They didn't rebuild anything, but the course just sort of grew in at the edges. So if you look at photos of Cypress in the 70s and 80s, it's still recognizable, but it had changed a lot since the 20s and 30s. And so Cypress has definitely done restoration work over the past few decades, and they had to do restoration work. This was initially in-house, and for the past decade or so with Bill Core and Ben Crenshaw consulting. And their approach has been very careful and very slow. They've gradually restored bunkers, put bunkers back that had been lost, or reshaped bunkers to their original style, or enlarged bunkers that had gotten smaller. They pushed out mowing lines. They took out a tree here and there. One of the biggest projects the club did recently was restoring the dunescape, actually. They cleared out a lot of the vegetation that had started to cover up the sand. And so the dunes now look amazing because they've been revealed again. At one point, they were pretty grown over. I love this approach because the course still feels old. It still feels like its original self. It's never been rebuilt or redone. Still has the actual McKenzie and Hunter architecture in the ground. They've never torn it up and replaced it. And I think that's amazing. But if you look at the earliest photos of Cypress Point, especially the ones taken by Julian Graham in the early 1930s, you can see that a lot of the greens used to be a bit bigger, even than they are now. that maybe some of their contouring was a little more detailed. Some fairways used to be wider, just little things like that, right? So I do think there's more restoration work to do. And I'm not saying that I think everything should be put back to exactly what it was in 1928. You have to let courses evolve and you have to trust some of your own current preferences. But those Julian Graham photos are pretty tantalizing. And I think they show a few details that would be good to bring back.
You mentioned that some of the greens used to be larger, and obviously you've also mentioned quite a few times the technology differences that we have now than they had in 1928. Is that one that you would like to see restored, or are you like the added challenge of a little bit smaller greens?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. Are smaller greens actually more challenging? I guess it depends on what's immediately on the border of the greens. If it's just rough or short grass, I don't know that they are necessarily more challenging if they're smaller. I think what you do when you expand greens back to their original size, and for the most part, Cypress Point has done a lot of this over the past couple of decades. The greens had really gotten to be small by the 80s. And they've definitely enlarged them since then and recaptured some of their contouring on the edges and the size. But what you do when you recapture more green surface is that you allow for pin positions out on the edges of the greens. And those pin positions can be very challenging. It means that you give your golf course more flexibility to challenge skilled players, like the ones who are going to arrive at the course for the Walker Cup. In a match play event, maybe there's no reason to try to manufacture a score to par that you want, because that doesn't matter. But if you really want to make these guys bleed a little bit, then expanding your greens can be a good idea because it allows you to put some of those pins in scary places. And I think that in a few cases at Cypress Point, that's what they could do. Specifically on the 7th green. It's funny that you mentioned the 7th hole earlier. It is such a beautiful hole. If you look at an early photo of that hole, you can see that there's more green in front that could be recaptured. There was a section of the green in the front, a little bit lower than the rest of the green, that was there in the late 1920s. Yeah.
It's now like fringe, right? It's like run up, like almost false front, run up fringe.
That's right. Exactly. So that's a key question for the club, looking at those details and considering, hey, do we want to bring that back? All right. So we've covered land, routing, design philosophy, greens, restoration work. That's my overview of Cypress Point's architecture. I think it's time now to bring in Josh Pettit to tell a few fun stories about specific holes and design ideas. Here's Josh. Joshua Pettit, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Always good to chat with you, Garrett. How are you?
I'm doing well. Just putting the finishing touches on the Cypress Point deep dive here. We've gotten to the point in this episode where we want to get a little more fine-grained about a couple of issues related to this golf course. We've kind of gone through a bunch of material, but here's, where we can kind of get more specific about a few things that happened during the construction process or particular holes that have interesting backstories. And so you and I talked about this beforehand, but we have kind of 3 topics to cover quickly here. The first is the story behind the 16th hole. So what do you want to tell me about the famous long par 3 16th hole over the ocean? Everybody knows this hole. What's the kind of interesting backstory here?
Possibly the most photographed hole in golf. I think the interesting backstory is the question of, was it intended to be a short par 4, a 2-shot hole, or was it always intended to be a par 3? And there's been a lot of conversation and debate about this. But if you look back through the correspondence, if you look back at some of Dr. McKenzie's writings where he wrote about this in The Spirit of St. Andrews and also in a few other articles that he published. And if you analyze all the various routing maps drawn by McKenzie, Raynor before that, other surveyors that surveyed the routings after McKenzie had put us together, if you look at all those various routing maps, there's all these clues, and then you combine that also with scorecards at different times in those early years, and there's sort of this mystery. And but when I put it all together, I think it was always, at the end of the day when the course opened, it was a par 3. But certainly McKenzie initially thought it would work better as a short par 4. The story that he recounts is via Marian Hollands from Seth Raynor before Seth Raynor passed away. So as you may have already talked about, or people may know, is Seth Raynor laid out the original routing on the property, but then he passed away in January of 1926, right as McKenzie happened to be making his way out to California. So when Seth Raynor was on what they identified as like the tee pad, there was this perfect little spot for a tee box with Marian Hollands. Seth Raynor said to Marian, it's a pity that the carry over the ocean is just too long. It wouldn't make for a par 3. And Marian said, I don't think it's impossible to carry. And then she teed it up and hit it and cleared it and hit it right to the center of what they had identified as the ideal green site. So that was recounted to McKenzie later when he was on site with Marian Hollands. And he was a bit suspect of how it would play. But ultimately, because the main thing that he was concerned about was ensuring that there were enough routes to the hole, safe routes to the hole, that golfers of any skill level could get there if they wanted to take an alternate longer route. And so when they ultimately played with some different tee positions and they looked at that fairway zone where that lone cypress tree is, McKenzie finally acquiesced and said, I think it'll work quite well. So there's a quote, that McKenzie has in his book, Spirit of St. Andrews, and he says, to give honor to where it's due, I must say that except for minor details in construction, I was no way responsible for this hole. It was largely due to the vision of Miss Marian Hollands. So he's kind of like saying, I get no credit for this. This was all her. And then he said, I doubted that this hole could be considered ideal because of what we said, how, there may not be any opportunities for the shorter hitters to clear it. Because I feared that with other Cypress Point holes, there was not sufficiently easy route for the weaker player. My mind was set at rest a few months ago. So this is when he was on site in 1927, his second site visit. But the interesting thing to me, going back to the routing plans, is that he still depicted a route for a 2-shot hole with a tee much further back that would have played it like 350. That was the yardage that was listed on some of the routing plans and on the scorecard, was that 350 yardage. And what's peculiar to me, it could have just been a misprint, is that in an article that was published after the course had already opened, it was listed as 350 yards from the back tee. So the question in my mind has always been, was there ever a back tee pad to begin with, like maybe an optional thing or not? It's kind of unclear. I've never seen any photographic evidence to show that tee was ever built back there. And the other interesting thing I think McKenzie lays out is that he realized, if you look at that fairway, there's the lone cypress tree that's hanging over.
Mm-hmm. The layup fairway on 16.
Exactly. And the landform is such that if you kind of aim at that tree, if you're trying to take the safer route, if you aim at that tree, and if you're a right-handed player, you hit a bit of a fade, then that landform will like kick you right down to the green, and you'll probably end up like just short of the green, and you'll have a fairly easy up and down, or a reasonable chance of getting up and down for a par.
All right. So the 18th hole, I understand that the par 4 18th hole at Cypress Point, much maligned, in fact, Cypress, often called, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, the greatest 17-hole course in the world. I don't like that line. I think it's unfair to the 18th hole, that the 18th hole is actually quite interesting, and so I'll defend it. But on a separate subject from whether the 18th hole is good or not, there was an idea for a tee box on the 18th hole that was pretty provocative, right?
That's right. If you're ever fortunate to be out there standing on the 18th tee and you look behind you out in the ocean, there's this island rock that's isolated from the rest of the coast. And the idea was, again, looking at all these routing maps, to have a tee box back there. And the hole would have played significant. It would have played, I measured it out. I think it would have been about an extra 80 yards. And that hole already plays uphill. So, currently from the back tee, it plays like 345. And had that tee been built out on the rock, it would have played 425 or 430. The tee didn't get built, and there's always been this question as to why. And my sense is there's a couple of factors there. One, we do know that, after the course opened in 28 and the course was in play, then, obviously the depression hit, end of 1929, 1930. But by 1931, they had engaged an engineer to do a plan for a suspension bridge. So in the back of Jeff Shackelford's book, which is a beautiful book, I highly recommend it, there's a detailed plan by an engineer for a suspension bridge to be built, and that's from October of 1931. So they were still looking at it as an option, at least at that point. And it never got built. And my sense is McKenzie probably, this is sort of my speculation, he probably liked the idea that it'd be a cool alternate tee, but probably was always a little suspect of how practical it would be to build and to maintain. But nevertheless, they did a plan for the bridge. It didn't get built. I do recount a story also that there was a land swap at one point with the adjacent land that sits right next to the 18th tee box, which is now used as like a parking lot for tourists to stop there and look out at the ocean. And so I don't know if it was just a factor of like that. If you look at the property line now, it kind of cuts in a way where the angle from that rock, even if they still owned the land where the rock was technically, it would have been just a crammed angle. So that could have been ultimately the reason, or it could have just come down to the fact that they decided they didn't want to spend the capital, in the early 30s in the midst of the Depression.
Here, by the way, is the plan in Jeff Shackelford's book. I'm holding it up to the camera. This isn't very good audio, but if you see the YouTube version of this episode, then you'll see that page in the book. But it's one of those kind of fantasy ideas that we all have when we look at a piece of coastline and we think, well, wouldn't it be cool if you could put a tee box out on that little rock?
It's always easy to be an armchair architect.
Yeah.
But when you actually are tasked with building and maintaining something, there's all these other practical considerations, not to mention, like budgetary stuff that you have to deal with, like you guys touched on it with regarding to the 14th hole.
So the last subject, Josh, that you wanted to get into here for a little more detail on a specific topic regarding Cypress Point has to do with the construction process. Now, David Normoyle and I, in the history section of this episode, covered some of these issues, how economical construction was, coming in under budget, and in a time frame that was astonishingly quick, really. But there's more detail here. There's a lot of interesting stuff about what happened during construction and the various methods that were used to build this course so efficiently. So what do you have for me there?
Yeah, so, if you read McKenzie's writings, his book, or his two books, and many of his articles, there's this reoccurring theme of economization of construction, economization of design, economization of greenkeeping. And you and I have talked about this before, Garrett, on another podcast. But specifically when it comes to Cypress Point, he wasn't just talking the talk, he really walked the walk. And I think this is a very underappreciated skill set that McKenzie had as an engineer and an economist, was his way to economize or value engineer a project to get better results for less money and to do things more efficiently. And got to keep in mind also that at this point in time, 1926, 27, when he first started laying out this property and building it, he had 20 years of experience building golf courses under his belt, starting with Allwoodley in 1906, 1907. So it had been 20 years where he had really honed his craft. I mean, there was the interruption with the Great War, but he had a lot of experience under his belt, trying different construction methodologies, figuring out what worked, what didn't. And that earned insight was extremely valuable when it came to the construction of Cypress Point, because this was a club that started from humble means. They didn't have an unlimited budget to build this golf course with. And, he pitched, when he met with them, he pitched them on this idea of, let me bring in my own construction team. This is sort of what we would refer to today as like the design build methodology. And he'd said, like, to the club, to the founders, let me bring my own team in and we could build this for a lot cheaper. And at the time they had bids from a couple of different contractors, and they said that the cheapest bid from all the experts would have been $150,000 to build the course. And McKenzie and Hunter said, no, we could build it for $100,000. And they thought that was like unduly optimistic. But as it turned out, they built it themselves with the American Golf Course Construction Company, which were his guys, managed by Robert Hunter's son, Robert Hunter Jr., and their guys that they brought over from Ireland and from Britain. And they built it for $90,000, which was, 40% less than contract value, which is very significant, and I did some math on, converting into inflation adjusted dollars, and it's pretty astounding that $150,000 in 1927 would be about $2.8 million today. That was what the bid was. They said they'd do it for $100,000. They ended up doing it for $90,000, which is like $1.65 million in real dollars. I mean, if you understand what things cost today in the world of golf course construction, I mean, it's astounding that they were able to do that.
And as David indicated earlier in the episode, it wasn't like this was a pure minimalist project by the standards of the 1920s. They moved some earth around. They had to do some things to that piece of land in order to render it golfable and turfable. And so it's very impressive that they did what they did for the cost.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize is actually how much manipulation they did have to do to the site. They had to build a lot of those green complexes out of not much, and a lot of the bunkering that looks very dunesy and natural was manufactured. And so just to give you a sense of what when they put their bid together and all the work that they did, what it included the $100 or the night, what ended up being $90,000 out the door, included a complete underground irrigation system, which was like a novelty in those days. This was just when people were starting to build subterranean, what they called hoseless irrigation systems. So they did that entirely, a massive drainage network, all the grassing, the seeding, the fertilizing, amending the soils. He mentions they amended 40 acres of soils. Clearing of 20, initially the scope was 20 acres of pines. Back there on that portion of the property, when you get out past 3, like 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, that zone was very, very densely wooded with Maury pines. And so they had planned to clear 20 acres, but they ended up clearing a lot more. So I think that's one of the interesting things is not only did they complete the scope of work for 40% less than contract value, but also they significantly increased the scope of work. So they added on an additional 15 acres of tree clearing. So instead of clearing 20 acres of trees, they cleared 35 acres of trees, which really opened those holes up significantly and gave you those vistas out to the dunes and to the ocean. So just imagine how different that property would look and play and feel if there was like a lot of dense forest back there in those holes blocking your vistas. So I thought that was like a pretty important component in the fact that that's a significant increase in the scope of work. They built twice as many tees as they'd originally planned to have optionality for different skill levels of players. And then they built all of these, turf walk paths that were irrigated, so from green to tees and from tees out to fairways, they had these walk paths like you'd see out in the British Isles a lot. And they enlarged the fairways significantly, like on the front, the beginning of holes, they significantly enlarged the fairways. Going back to, again, what we talked about on 16 is that McKenzie wanted to have plenty of play space short off the tee, so there weren't these forced carries. So that was like more soil prep, soil amendment, more grassing. And you'll be pleased, Garrett, to know that they included every conceivable luxury, including drinking fountains in all the shaded places.
Just adding that on, got to have those. Maybe put some ball washers out there. All right. Well, Josh, thank you for doing research into these different specific topics around the Cypress Point project. Always enjoy having you on the podcast, and talk to you again soon.
Always nice talking with you, Garrett. Looking forward to see you at the Walker Cup.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm back with Will Balsam, producer of Designing Golf. That was Josh Pettit, and we're here now just to wrap things up for this deep dive. And I want to just talk about Cypress Point's position in the world of golf, where not necessarily where we rank it, but kind of how it compares to the other great candidates for the best golf course in the world. And I think one of the best comparisons I can come up with is to the West Course at Royal Melbourne, which I saw for the first time last December. And I think it's an interesting comparison, partly because a lot of what Royal Melbourne does really, really well, Cypress Point maybe does slightly less well, but Cypress Point still has the edge in other categories. So at Royal Melbourne, I think the preservation of that golf course, and especially the turf presentation, is absolutely top of the line. Couldn't be better than it is currently at Royal Melbourne. That course is firm and fast, and they've taken a similar approach as Cypress Point has to the preservation of their golf course. They have not dug up their greens and put in air conditioners. They haven't, put in all the modern amenities. It is a vintage golf course, and they've preserved it really, really well with the help in recent years of Tom Doak. And so there are some similarities with Cypress Point, but I think Royal Melbourne might be maybe a little bit farther along in that process than Cypress, at least when it comes to green sizes and things like that. And especially when it comes to the cultivation of really good golf turf. Royal Melbourne might have a little bit of tree removal remaining to be done, but it's pretty darn close to its ideal self. On the other hand, Cypress Point is obviously a more spectacular golf course. It just clearly, the dunes, the ocean, the combination of all these things, the brilliance of the routing, there is nothing like Cypress Point in the world. So I don't know really if it's a better golf course than Royal Melbourne West or the composite course at Royal Melbourne, but it is a more wonderful golf course. I think the adjective wonderful is the one that I always think of when I think of Cypress Point. It is the most wonderful golf course that I know of. It is the most amazing one, the most stunning one. And I think that shouldn't be discounted, even by golf nerds who are maybe a little bit past just aesthetic appeal and splendor, and maybe are looking at other things to indicate the quality of a golf course, Cypress Point's wonderfulness is something that I don't think has any equal in the world of golf.
Does it have the lore of Augusta National? Does it have that for the people who maybe aren't you, me, and the rest of the golf nerds listening to this?
Clearly, it doesn't have the tournament history and the familiarity of Augusta National. Augusta National, for being a club that's reputed to be very exclusive, it is one of the most accessible, exclusive golf courses in the world. I mean,
you and I can play with our eyes closed.
Right, exactly. You know, we maybe it's hard to actually play the course, like get golf clubs out there for most people. But to walk the course and attend the Masters, I mean, a lot of people do. They open their golf course up so wide, and to TV as well, especially in recent years, now that they've gone to every hole coverage. And so that element of sheer familiarity, the connection to people's childhoods, their memories of parents and grandparents watching the Masters with them and observing this beautiful golf course, that's something that no other course can have that doesn't have Augusta National's history. And I think you can say the same about the Old Course, with the Open going back there every 5 years, and there is a lore and a mystique that grows up around it. Cypress Point's mystique is something different, right? It is so much more low profile, and that creates a lore of its own, right?
Definitely. It's funny, the added mystique. You would think, I don't know, to me, when the conversation comes up of what's one golf course in the world that you would play if you were given the opportunity, more than 9 times out of 10, the answer I'm hearing is Augusta National. But I agree to you where it's like, shouldn't it be the place that most people maybe have never even seen or know much about other than the 16th hole?
Right. Yeah. And you know, Cypress Point's argument for being the last golf course that you would play is a very strong one, because of the way the round ends and the build up to those incredible moments on the 15th and 16th holes. I will never forget my first shot on the 16th hole. It's a memory that is permanently with me and that I'm going to have until I die. I'm going to be able to see that ball fly. I had a good shot. You
didn't dump it into the water right in front of you.
If I had duck hooked it into the bay on the backside of the hole, I might feel this differently. But I managed somehow to hit a good shot, and I'll never forget it. It's going to be one of the most special things in my brain until my brain stops working. And Cypress can create those moments because of its splendor and the drama of the way it builds up to those holes. And that's kind of what it offers as the course that you would want to play before you go to the electric chair, right?
Yeah. 100%. And we know it's already a good match play course, of course, so that helps as well.
Yes, very much looking forward to the Walker Cup. I think it's going to be so much fun to see these players take on this course. As I indicated earlier, they're going to be really long for this golf course. I mean, they're going to be playing from some places on these holes they're going to be hitting wedges into 450-yard par fours that you and I would hit 7 woods or more into. And so, yeah, I think that might, for people familiar with the course, there might be a little bit of heartburn seeing it that way.
I was going to say, most people will be none the wiser, so I'm not sure it'll make a huge difference.
Exactly. Just seeing the course on TV, seeing the holes themselves, seeing players take them on will be great. And guess what? If it happens to be windy, if the wind kicks up there, it's going to be hard. It'll be hard. And it's not a big deal because it's match play anyway. But
right.
But that golf course can definitely be very difficult if the elements make for that. So I think there's a lot to look forward to with the Walker Cup. Any particular holes that you're keeping an eye out for?
I think the par fives there are super interesting. I mean, I know for them, maybe it won't be as interesting because of the length that they have, but some of the risk reward on the second shots or going for these greens, especially since they are kind of smaller greens, could provide for some interesting situations. I don't know, just going over through watching the hole by hole and seeing kind of some of these tee shots and the lines that you have to take if you want to get there in two. I think it could provide some really interesting match play holes.
Absolutely. And something to look out for is the 8th hole, which kind of plays diagonally across over the shoulder of a dune. And the question on the hole is, how much of the dune are you going to take on? Mere mortals are just considering taking on maybe half of the dune, right? Instead of playing out to the left to the fairway that you can see. The hole turns to the right. But I think a few players at the Walker Cup might have an eye on the green there, like might be looking to cut the hole corner. And so that would be something to look out for. On the 17th hole, the same thing. I mean, it's a long poke to get to the green from the tee. I think it's probably about 360 yards on a direct line, but I don't know. Could the green be in play there? That would be one little bit of intrigue. But then there are plenty of holes that I think do limit distance naturally, will kind of force driver out of players' hands, have them lay up to a certain yardage, a certain angle, and then play some longer, more interesting approaches into the greens. So I think the course is going to hold up fine,
Definitely. And you mentioned 8. I feel like that could also be so pin position dependent, right? If that pin's tucked back left behind that bunker, that probably brings in a different drive in how much of that dune you're taking on versus if it's, a front center stick and you're okay with having, a short to mid iron in. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. There are going to be such a great number of subtleties to the golf course that I hope the telecast focuses on those a little bit and maximizes the opportunity of an event like the Walker Cup being at a course like Cypress Point, because it's a relative rarity. I'm not sure when the next time is that we'll see the course on this kind of stage.
And depending how it goes, it may be the last time.
Yeah, exactly. I hope it goes well. All right, Will, thank you very much for hanging out during these portions of the episode. That is our deep dive on Cypress Point. This episode of Designing Golf was produced by Will Balsam. Thank you, Will. If you like this kind of deep dive content on golf architecture, then make sure to check out Fried Egg Golf Club, FEGC. Go to thefriedegg.com/membership to see everything that we offer with Fried Egg Golf Club. There's a lot more than just architecture content, but we do have architecture content. If you're into that, we have weekly course profiles that provide really fine-grained analyses of great golf courses. And we have another weekly segment that I do where I talk about what's new in golf architecture, news and scuttlebutt in the golf architecture industry. So those are just a couple of the things that we offer through FEGC. Again, thefriedegg.com/membership. We're building a great community in the club, so we'd love for you to join us. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back again soon with another episode.